Okay, as you see, I'm WA6TWA, licensed since 1961, and I got my general a year later. In the 1960s, and before, of course, the T hunts were on AM, on 2 meters. Is there anyone there that has not been on a T hunt? Everyone's been on T hunts? So the goal is to, find a transmitter that's hidden someplace. In this case, someplace in Los Angeles. My parents'
And there are
car.
two different
So it was
variations
like
on
on
exciting
determining
even
who
from that point
wins.
of view.
Either the shortest distance, which is measured by taking the odometer reading at the starting point and when you find it, and the first one to find, which is a timed T hunt. Most of them that we went on was the shortest distance, and that's advantageous because you can take your time. You don't have to drive fast. You could, pull off the side of the road, break out your maps, and talk about, what to do next. So I always preferred that when I was a kid, and they were typically on Saturday nights from like 8 to 11. And we would meet at some Bob's Big Boy to, share our stories afterwards. I don't have any photographs of the actual T hunters of the cars back then. So what you see are just reasonable facsimiles that I found on the internet. Before I tell you what we used, let me tell you what we didn't have in 1963. We didn't have obviously smartphones, email. We didn't even have cassette recorders, no search engines, no TV with hundreds of channels. There weren't even any commercial satellites back then. Obviously, no computers. That was, the topic of a science fiction story, that everyone would have a computer at home. And like I said, the Intelsat, the early bird wasn't even up yet, so there was no commercial satellites. And you'll see the red asterisks populating a lot of the systems. That's to indicate that the pioneers of those systems weren't even born yet. So we didn't have Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Page and Brin for the search engines. There weren't Zuckerbergs and the people that came up with Twitter, no eBay, no PayPal, no Google Maps. So there basically wasn't any of this high technology around. What was around, this is it. You either have a telephone plugged into the wall or you go to a telephone booth. These days, all the parents say, if there's an emergency, call me on your cell phone. Well, when I was a kid, if there was an emergency, go to a phone booth. I never went to a phone booth, until I was dating somebody when I was 18 or 19. So the idea of going to, having a phone at your fingertips, it was totally non-existent. And of course, the other mode was the Western Union telegrams that you would get if someone got married or had a kid. But this was basically what was around in 1963. That was it, other than, of course, ham radio. Here's the technology, the modern technology that we had in 63. Black and white TVs, and in Los Angeles, there were only 7 black and white channels on VHF. There was no UHF at that time. And this is a picture of what I probably looked like holding the rabbit ears for my parents to see a show without ghosts or without the vertical or horizontal hold breaking. So one of us had to be at the rabbit ears, and then they'd finally say, stop, that's it, don't move. And that's what you had to do. And of course, the portable radios had these very heavy B batteries with the 1U4 tubes, et cetera. So there were heavy things that you'd lug around. And back then, it even had the civil defense stations at 640 and 1240 kilocycles back then. So that was some of the technology that we had 61 years ago. Here's the computer of the 1963. It basically occupied an entire room, cost about $1 million, and you'd have to have a defense contract in order to afford one of these things. There's obviously there weren't any commercial private versions of this thing. And of course, our phones is 1,000 times faster, 1,000 times more memory. 1,000th the cost and about a 10,000th the volume. And now everybody has one. It's just amazing. I'm amazed at how long the batteries last in these things. So that's the computer of back then. The calculators that at least I had when I was in high school were trigonometric tables or log tables, these 100-page books that you would look up these functions and add them, subtract the logs to do division or multiplication. And of course, there's a slide rule that the kids today have no idea what that is. That was our processor to do multiplication, division, square roots, cube roots, trigonometric functions, hyperbolic functions. It was amazing how clever the inventors, Leibniz and Newton, I believe, were that came up with the slide rule. But that was the extent of our calculators in '63. Yeah, we had to take a slide rule test in chemistry class. And there was one kid that was able to do all these things in his head. He didn't need the slide rule. And the chemistry teacher said, "You're ready to take the test, but Don Silver, you cannot use your brain." That was a requirement for him. So he was forced to use the slide rule. For $1, you can do a lot of things back in 1963. You can get a gallon of gas that might not last an entire T-hunt, but quite a ways. Buy a Big Mac, have a Coke, and have enough postage to send the results to your relatives back east. All that for under $1. Now that we kind of set the stage for what was around back then, let's talk about, the elements of the T-hunt. There was the person that hid the transmitter. I don't think in those days we called them the fox. We would just call it the person that hides the transmitter. And that's a photograph of a Gansett communicator 1 or 2. That was like the workhorse those days. It weighed about 22 pounds, had that beautiful magic green eye. It was called a Goonie bird because people, associated a Goonie bird with the shape of that thing with the antennas sticking up and the green eye. The T-hunter had similar equipment in his car. It was like a small airplane. There was your driver, there was the radio operator that ran the rig and a beam antenna, and there was typically me in the back seat. I was the navigator because I was the youngest. This is a typical map of Los Angeles in 1960. There were 2 starting points, the Van Nuys Recreation Center in the Valley on, I believe, Magnolia and Van Nuys Boulevard. It wasn't called Van Nuys Rec Center. It was just a dirt parking lot and a small park. That was it. And then in Inglewood, about 6-7 miles east of the airport, there was Darby Park. And they would alternate on weekends, and sometimes there'd be a starting point at the Baldwin Hills, and that was it. Another thing that I recall from back then, there was so few freeways. You can probably name them on 1 or 1.5 hands. And back then, they didn't refer to the numbers. My father would be told to get to his next job, take the Harbor Freeway to the Santa Ana Freeway to the Long Beach Freeway, and then go on the San Bernardino Freeway. Now, they're all numbers. You take the 101 to 134 and go up the 118 to the 170, and there you go. The nomenclature has changed. But this was about the only stuff that the only major roads that we had back in the 60s. And here's a little more detail about the equipment. They were AM rigs. The Goonie bird was the technology of the late 50s and early 60s. It was crystal controlled, had about 15 watts input with that beautiful magic eye in the center that would wink at you instead of a meter, depending on the signal strength. And in a darkened car, for a kid, it was just really neat to see that. And when I became a ham, I saved up my money doing paper routes and the like, and I got a used Heathkit Pawnee. That was the technology of the early to mid 60s. That had a VFO in addition to crystal control, but you couldn't use that unless you had a I forgot if a technician was allowed to use it, but a general, you needed to use a VFO. And it actually had an S meter instead of a winking eye. There was that little vertical meter on the left side that was an S meter. And how do we communicate with everybody back then? There was this real neat repeater, K6MYK, that was on the top of the Hollywood Hills near the Hollywood sign on Mount Lee. It had an input of about 145.22 megacycles back then, and an output of 146.98. And you'd go to these stores and get a special crystal that put you exactly on that 145.22. And the T hunts were around 146.3. And again, all this was on AM. And that repeater was a wonderful gadget that was built by Art Gentry, I believe was his name, W6MEP, that built that on his own with the help of others. And it was on up on the Hollywood Hills. And with that, I was able to break the repeater with a Heathkit tour, and then I'd be able to communicate with anybody in Los Angeles with that. Now there's so many FM repeaters that you need it comes with a phone directory. There's so many of them. And if you look on the right side, there's a little handle on top of that 22-pound weight, and that made it portable. Just like your Sony TVs that weighed about 50 pounds had a handle on top, and that made it portable. So what's portable today and portable back then were totally different. So that's some of the equipment. Here's the other equipment. This was our GPS. It consisted of going to a gas station like a Shell or a Chevron or a Standard and just getting one of their fold-out maps that they actually gave for free. And you just attach that on a clipboard. And I have my pink pearl eraser because I made a lot of mistakes, a pencil and a straight edge to draw the direction of the bearings. And we had typically a 5-element beam antenna. I couldn't afford one of these commercial antennas, so I just got a couple pieces of wood and some coat hanger wire and made my own antenna with RG58 cable. And then we had a small flashlight with D cells and a small filament that was kind of a yellowish color that didn't last very long. But that was our GPS. And our beam antenna was mounted on the side of a car. Those cars had side vent windows back in the 50s and 60s. So you can just get some rope and tie it around the window. That was our beam antenna, but it would rotate by itself. So someone had to hold it by hand, which was fine during the summer when it was 80 degrees at night. But during the winter, it would be like in the 50s or the high 40s sometimes. And it was really cold. You'd have to wear gloves or thick flannel shirt. But that was how we would get our directions. Hal, WA6SZY, got instructions how to build a helical antenna that he mounted on a reflective dish. It probably wasn't perfectly designed for 2 meters. That dish didn't look like it was big enough in diameter, but it worked. And it really looked space age back then. And we would, on a couple hunts on Hollywood Boulevard, people would stop us and say, "What are you looking for?" And we'd say, "Oh, we're looking for a downed Russian Sputnik." Because back then, there was like the Cold War. The Russians beat us in the space age initially, putting up these Sputniks in 1957. You know, that was really on the news back then. So a lot of people actually believed us when we're told them we're looking for Russian Sputniks. I don't know how people would believe a couple teenagers driving around in an old car, but we had fun doing that. And of course, when we would get close to the transmitter, we would light up the hillside or wherever we're looking. The rich people had aircraft landing lights that were mounted in beautiful enclosures that drew 600 watts. And if you would put that face down on your vinyl car seat, it would burn a hole in it, but it had a range of a couple thousand feet. In our case, I'd go down the alley to a Shell gas station, look in the trash can for old headlights that were dual beam, and one of the beams would be burnt out, but the other beam would work. And we would just connect a zip cord with a cigarette lighter plug, and we would use that. That would have like 1/10 the range, a couple hundred feet, and also draw about 1/10 the power. So it was inferior to the them, as we called it, but we actually won some T-hunts using the us headlight. When we would get close to the transmitter, we would build these homebrew little sniffers. And they were basically, in our case, it was just a little diode radio with a little amplifier that we get at a war surplus store. And in those days, war surplus was really war surplus. It was stuff from World War II. You can buy these beautiful microamp meters for like about $1 or something and get these bud enclosures and drill some holes and make your own sniffer. And the diodes would only be like a dime or a quarter, a 1N21 as an example. In the next bin, I saw a 1N21B, and that really looked space age. It was a ceramic case with brass or gold coated contacts. And I said, this is the cat's meow. I'm going to buy that for like 50 cents. And it presumably had better noise parameters, but that was up at the hundreds and hundreds of megahertz. For the T-hunt, it really didn't make any difference. But as a kid, I said, I'm going to get one of those. I couldn't afford the holder for it, so I just used an alligator clip to secure it. And that came back to haunt me, as I'll show you later. But that's what we used to build the sniffers. These days, the sniffer is all solid state, the antenna is lightweight, and you can hold it in one hand. And this was taken about 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So I'm sure they're even more sensitive and more lightweight these days. But that was a sniffer. So now I would walk around and schmooze with all these T-hunters. I was only 13 years old or 14 years old. I had a grand time. I was looking at my competition and looking in their cars and seeing all their rigs light up. And then around 8 o'clock, someone would say, hey, the transmitter's on. And you hear a tone or a relaxation oscillator, and people would start getting all excited. It's on. What direction is the bearing? How strong is it? Let's check out the maps. And this is an artist's conception of what it might look like. K6OV published a real nice book on T-hunts. This is on the front cover, and it shows a couple fellows in a car looking out at the city before them at night. And that's kind of what the scene looked like. And the neat thing about it is it was on AM, and you'd hear all the hash as you're rotating the antenna. And when you get in the direction of the transmitter, you'd hear the tone start to build up an amplitude. So you'd hear, then it would fade out. Then you go back. That's my imitation of what you'd hear. Sorry about that. But I loved the sights and sounds of the T-hunt back then. These days, it's more fancy. It's on phased arrays, and I'll show you that in a second. And it doesn't make all that noise like it used to. But the displays are space age. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But I like the old stuff. And I like the CW also. Now that I've given you a little bit of background, I'm going to show you like 5 different T-hunts that I picked out of the collection that we went on. These are just photographs of, from magazines. These days, a lot of kids and adults go on T-hunts that you walk around in a park and you have the sniffers. And in the upper left, you see all these people looking down. When I first saw this picture, I thought they were all texting their friends, but these are actually ham radio operators looking at their signal strength with their sniffers as they walk around a park. So the range might be like a mile or something. But they also have T-hunts in cars these days, and it can be across the state. They've really extended the range of these T-hunts. But these hunts I'm talking about are from 63 to 65. This is my first T hunt in 1963. It was hidden someplace in the hills above Glendale, the Verdugo Hills, about 18 miles from the starting point. I only know that because I did a Google map these days, so I'm able to get the actual distance and realized I was only 14 years old. My mode of transportation was a Huffy foot brake bike, or I would take the bus, or I would hitch. In those days, everybody hitchhiked, girls and boys. It was no different. I mean, and people were a lot more respectful and trustworthy back then. So we would do that. And I was relegated to maps because I just was starting, but it was still a lot of fun. We started, and this is an artist conception, we started at the Van Nuys Sherman Oaks Recreation Center, which is what it's called today. Back then, it was just called a park. Now it has to have a lot of description to sound more impressive. But to me, a park is a park, and they're all great. And like I said earlier, the starting point in this park was just a dirt road that was real bumpy. As you're driving around, the cars would bottom out as they're going over these little hills in the parking lot. But that's where we all started. Here's the first bearing we got. It was pointed from the starting point in the direction of the Verdugo Hills. And it was a cold, dark, moonless night. So it added to the excitement of this tea hunt. The sounds, it wasn't just a tone, it was like a relaxation oscillator going pew, pew, pew. It sounded so space age, like I was in a science fiction movie as a kid. And the person that was hiding the transmitter would get on every 10 minutes to identify himself. And he said, "We are out here on Mount Suribachi." Well, I was just starting junior high school. I had no idea what Mount Suribachi was. Of course, it's an important hilltop in Iwo Jima, but I had no idea what it was. It just all sounded great. And I went with Hal, WA6SZY, who was a neighbor across the street, who really influenced me a lot in ham radio, who I'd like to acknowledge. And his buddy Lou, WB6IRI, that supplied the car. And he later became a ham radio operator. Now, I realize we get a bearing out toward the mountains, but we had no idea about the range. It could be at the starting point, 10 feet away. And some T hunts, they actually hit a flea power transmitter at the starting point. And some people would get a reading in this direction and they'd say, I want to go the least number of miles. I think it's a Mount Wilson. And they would take the freeways up to Mount Wilson and then realize that there's no signal up there because it was hidden back at the starting point. On the other hand, it might be at Mount Wilson. So you really have no idea what the range is, but at least you know the direction when you're starting. And these are the tools that we had, like I said. We had a beam antenna, we had the Hal's communicator, my shell map, a flashlight, and a little Rayovac floodlight if we ever got out of the car. Okay, that was how it started. Well, we did rudimentary triangulation. We would drive down the street. We would take our time because it was a mileage hunt. There wasn't a timer. And then we take a bearing maybe about a mile down Ventura Boulevard or wherever we were. And I would draw another line on the map. And then we go a little further, draw another line. And if we passed the transmitter, the line would go kind of in the backward direction, the fourth line you see on the right. And if we did our homework right and you drew a little circle around where the lines intersected, that's roughly where the transmitter is. But some of the people would use little tricks and they would aim their beam at one of these natural gas tanks, these, large cylinders with the roof that would collapse as the gas was distributed to the customers, and that would act as a wonderful reflector. And then everyone would head toward that structure, not realizing the transmitter is not there. It's actually in the direction of the person that aimed his beam in that direction. So the hiders use some interesting tricks. Sometimes they change the polarization of their beam. Other times they would reduce the power as people would get closer, and you're thinking the range was further out. So they used all kinds of tricks. Some of the more clever hiders are probably still out there in the mountains because their tricks are so impressive. In any case, it was hidden somewhere in the hills above Glendale. While we were driving, this is before FM radio became popular, we would listen to all these neat songs of the early 60s. Louie Louie, the Harlem Shuffle, Suspicion, Runaway, Please Mr. Postman, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? I mean, we would sing along with these songs as we were driving down Van Nuys Boulevard. And these radios had these mechanical push button selectors that you pull out and jam in on the station that you'd like. And that's how we would select the stations we'd listen to. So the T-Hunt, in addition to the relaxation oscillator, had some, really enjoyable, fun music for teenagers playing in the background. And here's the results of the T-Hunt. The Magic Eye, which I saw a close-up of, was actually closed shut. This one isn't, but that means you have a maximum reading. And we were driving along the Verdugo Mountain Way, and we would take out this Rayovac floodlight and start walking up random paths up these hills in pitch black darkness. There are no lights up there at the time. So you're walking around, there was no moonlight, and we didn't have a sniffer at the time. So we were just hoping we would trip over the transmitter, but we never found it. But it was so much fun. It was the first hunt I ever went on. It was really memorable, and we all had a great time. And we tried little tricks like tuning off the frequency so we would, hear a weaker signal, hoping that now with the beam we can get a better heading. But when we were up there in the hills, the signals were bouncing all over the hills. So it was really hard to get a more precise bearing as we tried to home in on the transmitter. But the three of us had a great time. Here is the next hunt, also in 1963. This was the most fascinating hunt I ever went on. It was hidden somewhere at LAX, 6.8 miles away from Darby Park this time, which was the starting point. Okay, and I'll tell you a little epilogue after we're done with this hunt. But it was really a wonderful hunt, something that you can never go on today for obvious reasons that I'll discuss as we go. Here's the initial bearing we got from Darby Park. It was out toward the beach. And I'm sure that a lot of the participants said, oh, it's in Malibu, or oh, it's in Palos Verdes. And they took, well, there weren't freeways going up there, but they would take Pacific Coast Highway and drive north or south to where they thought the transmitter was. It wasn't there. It was at the airport. That's the direction of the initial bearing. These are the tools we had, the Goonie Bird, WA6SZY's helical beam, which really looked space age, our handy dandy shell map. We didn't have the sniffer yet. It's before I ever built one. So that's what we had. And that was our initial bearing. The same two fellows, WA6SCY and WB6IRI, were the driver and the radio operator for that hunt. Here's where we ended up. A bunch of cars with antennas all parked in front of the TWA terminal, which doesn't exist today. This is an interesting photograph from 1963 of the LA International Airport, 20 years before the second deck was built. So there was no second deck. Look how few cars there are there. There are even more cars at the Burbank Airport these days, and probably more cars at the Camarillo Airport these days. But back then, there was hardly anybody there. And we all parked at the curb. There was no PA system saying loading only or tow away. You cannot leave your car. There was none of that. Everybody just parked there and we just started walking in. It was a strong signal pointing into the terminal. And here's the TWA terminal, a beautiful mosaic lined wall along the walkway. I think that still exists today. So the signal was coming from inside. Fly the friendly skies on 2 meters. And again, this is the equipment we had. We had the Goonie bird and antenna and the map. But now what do? We're inside this building. We don't have a sniffer, but Lou said, hey, I can take the car battery out of the car, you know, the 6 or 12-volt battery, whatever he had. I can hold that. I have jumper cables. We can connect that to the Gonset. And then we have RG58 that goes to the beam antenna. And they said, Pepper, you can hold the antenna. Hal held the Gonset and Lou held the battery. And the three of us walked in side by side up this terminal entrance. Nobody said a word. And here's what we looked like. We looked like the Wizard of Oz walking up the yellow brick road. Here is the straw man. That was Lou holding the battery. The Tin Man, Hal holding the Gonset. And the Lion, I'm holding this helical beam antenna, twisting it around as we're walking up. The Goonie bird had a real loud, real good amplifier. So we heard this beeping tone going on, echoing through this hallway because it had very nice solid walls. And there was no TSA, no x-rays, no searching. We can leave our shoes on. No one told us to take our shoes off, of all things. Can you imagine going up the hallway today with even one of these pieces of equipment? A beeping Gonset communicator with cables strung from it? You know, you'd be surrounded by the NSA, the TSA, the NBC, the ABC, all these three-letter agencies. You wouldn't be able to walk an inch without being detained, and you'd have to call your lawyer. In any case, that's what we looked like walking up. But it was, back then, it was exciting. It was so much fun. But we walked to the end of the hallway. We thought it was going to be hidden in the hallway. We took the staircase or the elevator up to the area where you waited to get on the airplane. Oh, we also looked like the Three Stooges. I didn't mention that. People would have been laughing at us, but no one did. It was a comical scene, the three of us walking side by side up this walkway. Okay, so we took the rig, the battery, the beam into the waiting area. This is like an old picture of what the waiting area might have looked like back then. And it turned out that the hidden transmitter was hidden in a Motorola bag. And it was all by itself at the end of a row, plugged in to a receptacle over there. Several things. If anybody left a bag by itself, even if it had apples and oranges in it, the bag would be surrounded by cops. But here was a bag that was buzzing with a 19-inch whip sticking out beyond it, and it was plugged into a socket. But nobody said a word. Can you imagine that today? I'm speechless thinking about that. And sadly, a hunt like that would never exist today. A teenager or anybody would never have this experience again. And we found it. We actually found the bag, and there are a bunch of guys walking around with sniffers. It was more hams than passengers in there. But we never found the guy that hid it. We thought he'd walk up to us. We never found him. But we had a great time. Here's the epilogue. 60 years later, last year, I was on a Yahoo chat room that W0RW, the friend of the guy in the audience that they knew since they were 12 years old. And I was mentioning this tea hunt back in 1963. Paul Signorelli responded 60 years later. He said, I was the fox. And I said, oh yeah, right. You were the fox. Tell me what was going on. And he said exactly what was going on. It was hidden in a Motorola bag with a whip antenna sticking out from it, with people walking around with sniffers in the passenger loading area. It was Paul. What are the chances that you'd be on a chat room on the internet, and here's Paul, who now lives in Colorado. He's an amazing man. He goes pedestrian mobile with a Vietnam era transceiver, and works people all over the world still in the Rocky Mountains. The man is a tribute to what people can do these days. He's an amazing guy. I wish I could meet him, but I've talked to him several times, and this thing was it just blew me away that he was the guy that hid the transmitter. Here is an interesting hunt. I have this one and another one, and then we'll call it a night. This was in 1964. It was hidden someplace in Hollywood, about 20 miles away from the starting point. Back then on Hollywood Boulevard, there was this huge Coca-Cola sign. I don't know if it's still there, but the Roosevelt Hotel is still there. Okay, Hal and Lou were going out with dates at that time. I didn't have anyone to take me on a tea hunt, but I was old enough to buy a used Honda 305 Dream motorcycle. It had a 12-volt battery. And I thought, oh, I'll put my Pawnee on the back rack and go on this hunt with this motorcycle. And everybody at the starting point was cracking up. They said, Pepper, a Pawnee on your rack? How are you going to get a bearing? Well, I thought I beat them to it. I soldered the 19-inch whip to the end of a piece of RG58 and went to Darby Park. And I started holding this thing in front of me, thinking that my body is a reflector, and I would twist around and I'd look for changes in the signal strength. And I figured that's the way I'll determine the bearing. It turned out that I was 100% wrong. The body doesn't act as a reflector that well at VHF frequencies. If anything, it acts as a very good absorber. So the right way to interpret what the signal is as you're turning around is when the signal goes through the greatest part of your body, you'll get a null. So this man is looking away from the transmitter, and he'll see the signal dip when the signal is directly behind him. So that's the way to interpret what happens when you twist around with a whip antenna. Exact opposite of a beam antenna, where the director is pointing toward the source with the reflector in the back. So you're looking at the transmitter instead of looking away from the transmitter. So what I did was exactly wrong. Here's an antenna pattern of a beam on the right, which you all recognize has gain in the forward direction, and a whip antenna on the left, where if you look closely, there's that little red dot, which is supposed to be the antenna, and it's pointing away from the source, and there's a null in the direction of the transmitter. It's not that sharp. This is like an artist's conception. And it's not a high gain system. It's a low gain antenna. It's called a body fade antenna as opposed to a high gain beam antenna. But that's the way to interpret this. Here's the bearing that the guys with beams got directly north from the starting point. And it was a little drizzly that night, and it was dark. And I just kind of followed them, thinking that I'll get closer, then I'll take more bearings. And we all drove north on Crenshaw Boulevard, which was, the main drag back in those days. And everything looked great. I would stop, I would try to take readings, I would barely hear any signals, but I would just hop back on and continue up north. Everything looked great until the Honda stalled. It turned out that the Pawnee drew so much from this small plastic encased battery, the electrical system couldn't support that, plus the headlights, and the motorcycle just stopped. Fortunately, this old motorcycle also had a Kickstarter in addition to the electric starter. Modern day motorcycles, I don't think, have Kickstarters anymore, so I'd have to pop the clutch or something these days. In any case, I had to disconnect everything to even ride that motorcycle. So the hunt was over for me. I said, well, it was fun while it lasted. I had fun talking to the fellows at the starting point. And I said, let me just drive up to Hollywood. because on Saturday nights, all these motorcyclists would meet on Hollywood Boulevard. A bunch of guys would meet at the Wax Museum. These weren't Hell's Angels. They were all nerds like me. They weren't ham radio operators. They were just guys in their Hondas, in their Vespas, motor scooters, their little Suzuki 50cc motorcycles. One guy had a BMW opposed cylinder motorcycle, which is really neat. So we'd all just chat for about 20 minutes in front of the Wax Museum. And then someone would say, hey, let's go to Pink's hamburger stand. Then everybody would get on their motorcycles and drive a couple miles to Pink's, which was on La Brea, right north of Melrose, I believe. And then someone else 20 minutes later would say, hey, let's go back to the Wax Museum. So it was like a bunch of pigeons flying back and forth between the Wax Museum and Pink's. That's what we did every Saturday night. It was a fun social gathering. So we kept doing that, and I had a great time with these people. They weren't hams. Then all of a sudden on Hollywood Boulevard, I see the tea hunters driving along Hollywood Boulevard. And remember, everything was packed up. I drove 20 miles without any equipment hooked up. And I see a bunch of tea hunters driving along Hollywood Boulevard. I said, hey, maybe I can participate in this tea hunt. Let me go to a random parking structure that happened to be next to the Chinese theater and set up. And I set up. The signal was so weak because the Honda battery was too weak to really function. And the sniffer didn't pick up a signal either. So it was like wishful thinking. I could have won the lottery that night. It turned out that the Fox, of all places, and this is the truth, hid the transmitter in the exact same parking lot that I randomly went into. He was just a couple levels below where I was, and his antenna was a whip that was dangled off the side of the parking structure off a RG58 cable. And I was like 1 or 2 levels above him without ever taking a reading after driving 20 miles. It's incredible. But you might ask, why didn't I pick him up with the sniffer? It was right there. Well, it failed because of vibrations. This alligator clip came off this beautiful ceramic space age diode, and the sniffer didn't work. I didn't know that. I just figured I wasn't within range of the sniffer. Isn't that amazing? Had I got the cheaper diode and soldered it like a good boy in this sniffer, I could have won that tea hunt 60 years ago because the war surplus meter would have pegged because I was like within 20 feet of the guy. I could have won the tea hunt just with my sniffer from 20 miles away. I could have had the fireworks going. I would have won first place. I would have got the last laugh. But that's water under the bridge. Looking back, it was amazing that all these, what ifs happened. But, that's the story of tea hunts. I'm sure you can share your interesting stories of tea hunts if you went on those. Okay, last tea hunt. I wanted to have a tea hunt while I was in high school. It was 1965. The range was about 500 feet from where the transmitter was. I say nerd cross nerd. I was a nerd squared because I was a ham radio operator. That's one nerd. I was in the chess club. That's another nerd. And I asked the sponsor of the chess club, Mr. Getzy, a teacher, I think a social studies teacher that ran the chess club, could I just put this little transmitter on top of your desk during the 1965 chess tournament that was in progress? It was real quiet in there, and it was a serious set of games because this was the annual tournament. But it was very quiet, and Mr. Getzy said, no problem. Well, the hunters all had sniffers, and they were searching around campus. This was during the lunch hour. And guess what? All of a sudden, loud beeping sniffers, one by one with antennas, came into the chess tournament, totally disrupting everybody because they were making these relaxation oscillator, like pew, 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 all these loud sounds as these three or four guys were running around the room looking for a transmitter. The chess club students had no idea what was going on. Mr. Getzey, let's just say I was reprimanded. There are a lot of different words that could describe Mr. Getzey's feeling about me. I don't remember, but chances are I had to forfeit that game that I was supposed to play that day. But I thought it was great. That is what happened in 1965, a lunchtime hidden transmitter hunt in high school. So I'm just going to review here. This is tea hunting in the 20th century. We used maps. We used 22-pound goonie birds with magic eyes. We used sniffers, which hopefully have their diodes soldered in place now. You rotated the antenna by hand. It made these fading static noises when you were rotating it with magic eyes, and used triangulation with the maps. That's the 20th century. K6OV, Joe Moll, who published that book, I'll show you a picture of it in a second. It's a classic, it's now in paperback, about transmitter hunts. It was published about 30 years ago, but the theory is the same, and he updates it on his websites. This isn't a commercial. He's just a great guy. He took my wife and I on a tea hunt in the 21st century. And again, this is all on AM. These days, it's on FM. AM is by the wayside. And a lot of cars have multiple whip antennas on the roof. A lot of police cars also have that. It turns out that there's now digital processing going on. You don't necessarily have to rotate an antenna, even though some people do have beam antennas for more precise readings with holes in the roof and fancy holders and everything. But you can get a good bearing just by adjusting the phase shift between these antennas and basically electronically sweeping the bearing without physically moving the antennas. And the display, which is in the bottom center, looks space age with, rotating like dials and concentric circle LEDs that kind of show the direction that the equivalent phase shifting antennas are pointing. But and they're commercially available. The lower left-hand side, you can buy a phased array processing system with antennas and a processor now. So you can just, if you shell out some bucks, you're all set for these tea hunts. The thing and we had a great time with Joe that night, and we found the transmitter. And on the lower right, that's me with the sniffer that Joe loaned me as we were approaching the transmitter, so I can have the joy of actually finding it. The thing that I didn't like in there is that it was as quiet as being in a pilot's cockpit on an airplane. All this phased array stuff was just moving lights and like speedometer type readings, but was direction. But you didn't hear anything. It was just really quiet. And I liked all the noise with it. It kind of, the tones and the fading signals and the relaxation oscillators and all that. That I really enjoyed. But this was a different philosophy of a tea hunt. This is just to let you know. Do I have 5 more minutes? This is what my ham radio station looked like in '63. I had an old Springfield 2-meter walkie-talkie that weighed about 10 pounds. It was like an oscillator whose receiver, I think, put out more signal than the transmitter. I was fortunate enough, my father actually got me a Collins 75A4. I had a Gonsa GSB 100 that operated on CW and phase modulation and single sideband. And of course, the Heathkit Pawnee. I had a Vibraplex keyer, the sniffer that stopped working at the wrong time, Mosley TA33 antenna, And I also got a hold of a Model 15 radio teletype machine with a control panel that looked a little bit similar to that. Now it's like on a chip. This thing looked like a lot. It was the size of a locker room, locker with all the patch cords and meters and stuff. I lost a lot of this in the Woolsey fire. We lived in the Santa Monica Mountains, and a lot of this stuff was destroyed in the Woolsey fire. But that's okay. We can still talk about it, and we live in Leisure Village. I'm a member of the Ham Radio Club here, and I really enjoy it. Just a little bit about me. I was raised in the late 50s and early 60s. I went to Hancock Park Elementary School that was near the farmers market in LA. It was so long ago that my pets were much bigger than me. You can now see remnants of them in the Natural History Museum. My first grade teacher, her claim to fame is that she claimed that she was the nurse that was in that famous Kiss with the Sailor in Victory in Japan Day in August of 1945. Since then, another lady and another sailor also claimed to be the couple. Maybe they were both there doing the same thing, but regardless, she got a lot of press and was in a lot of parades and went to a lot of Veterans Day gatherings and taught children about World War II with veterans many years ago. So she really did a lot for our country. I was known as the scientist in the fourth grade. I always loved that stuff. I delivered newspapers in the 60s, and I ran World War II searchlights as a high school student for advertising. That was a fun job I had. We went all over the place, from Disneyland to Universal Studios to nightclubs to car showings. I worked at the Stanford Linear Accelerator as a junior and senior at UCLA, and we were doing particle physics. And they don't do particle physics anymore at that Stanford Accelerator. They use that as a source for highly collimated and monoenergetic X-rays for studying molecules and the like. I got my Ph.D. at Caltech, and I was fortunate enough to have a paper published in Scientific American on my thesis topic, which was time-reversed light. And I worked at HRL Labs in Malibu for 31 years. That's where the world's first laser was demonstrated in 1960 by Dr. Mayman using a crystal of ruby. I was still a student at Hancock Park Elementary School at the time. Back then, they thought these lasers could be held in your hand and blow up tanks and the like. So these are the true adventures of Ruby Laser, which was like a little comic strip back in the early 60s. At the research labs, one of the projects I worked on was laser ultrasonics, where we use laser beams instead of transducers to ping materials to launch acoustic waves in materials without having to touch the material. So you can actually analyze red hot steel pipes as they're being extruded using pulse laser beams to generate ultrasound and to receive it without having to touch something that's at like 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. I was fortunate enough to have a paper published late last year in a magazine called American Scientist on that topic. You can still get that at the library or on the internet and read about laser ultrasound. I wasn't a pioneer in that. We just advanced the technology like a lot of people did at research labs back then and to these days. Okay, last slide. I want to thank you for your time. Let's go tea hunting. Last slide. Here's the book by Joe Mole on the right side. There's a bunch of tea hunt presentations and websites that I have. Maybe a lot of you have that. Transmitter Hunting by Joe Mole. He published a paper in CW VHF about tea hunts from the Goonie birds to today's era, and I helped contribute to that. He's an excellent author, very well known in the area of tea hunts. So with that, I will thank you very much. I thank you for all your attention, and I hope you enjoyed my talk. Thank you.